Abraham Lincoln was the President of the United States during the Civil War and the Commander-in-Chief of the Union Army. Ulysses S. Grant was the general of the Union Army, and he did not like being defeated. Other generals of the Union Army were George B. McClellan and John Pope. Jefferson Davis was the President and the Commander-in-Chief for the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. Robert E. Lee was the General Commander for the Confederate Army. Other military leaders in the South were Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, and George Pickett. The Confederates had good, well-experienced leaders, and they knew their land better than the Union Army. It was hard for the Confederate Army to get foreign aid because Europe did not recognize them as an independent state. They relied heavily on foreign trade, and they had more guns than they did men. The Union had President Lincoln as leader and 2.2 million people in the Union. Not only that, but commerce, industrial base, and railroads allowed for the Army to replenish faster. The Army had to invade and conquer an area larger than Western Europe, and the Union Army actually wanted and needed to win, while the Confederates were just holding them off. The Union Army was not familiar with the land of the Confederates. They didn't know the easiest and safest way in and out. The Confederate strategy was to defend and delay until the Union gives up. The Confederates wanted quick victories, demoralizing the Union. They wanted to get an alliance with Great Britain, and the South was on the defensive side unless the North gave them a chance to attack. They used guerrilla warfare as a way of defending their land, and as they were on the defensive side, the soldiers believed the war they were fighting to protect was actually theirs. The Confederates had little industries, so they relied on trade. The Union Navy blocked all ports where the Confederates would receive their goods. The Union Army wanted to control the Mississippi River, and they knew that if they gained control, then they will have control over what is shipped to the Confederacy. The Union strategy was known as the Anaconda Plan. General Winfield Scott came up with the plan, which was a plan for the Union Navy to blockade the southern coastline like a snake down the Mississippi River. Fort Sumter is where the first shots of the Civil War took place. The Union Army's major was Robert Anderson. At the time, the Union occupied the fort. When President Abraham Lincoln said that he would resupply the Army at the fort, Confederate General Beauregard attacked Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. This was a physical victory for the South, but a political victory for the North. During the Battle of Bull Run, the Union decided to capture the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond. The battle was 25 miles between the two armies. The Confederates won the battle. Once the battle was over, Lincoln replaced McDowell with General George B. McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest one-day battle, resulting in 23,000 deaths. McClellan was the leader for the Potomac Army, and Lee was the leader for the Army of Virginia. It ended with a stalemate, but it was the first time the North didn't lose. After the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Shiloh was fought over 2 days, from April 6 to April 7 in 1862. It took place in southwestern Tennessee, and the Confederate Army was led by General Albert Sidney Johnston. The Confederate Army attacked the Union at Pittsburgh Landing, and since the soldiers were new recruits, the line broke quickly. General Albert Johnston was killed on the battlefield. The Union suffered 13,000 casualties, including 1,700 dead, and the Confederates suffered 10,000 casualties and 1,700,000 dead. The Battle of Vicksburg was a major victory for the Union during the Civil War. It was from May 1863 until July 4, 1863. The commander for the Union force was General Ulysses S. Grant, and the leader of the Confederates was General John Pemberton. Grant bombed Vicksburg until the Confederates surrendered. He knew that they would run out of food as the conditions became worse. On July 4, 1863, the Confederate general surrendered to Grant. The Battle of Gettysburg took place in July of 1863. The Confederate Army was led by General Robert E. Lee, and the Union Army was led by General George Meade. The battle took place over 3 days. On the first day, the armies were still coming together. The second day, both sides were at full force. The Union had 94,000 soldiers, and the Confederates had 72,000. The third day, General Lee decided to go full force, all or nothing. He sent General Pickett with 12,000 soldiers to fight at the heart of the Union Army. Pickett and his men were defeated with over half of them injured and or killed. General Lee and his army retreated. Even though the Confederates retreated, President Lincoln was disappointed that Meade and his men did not finish off Lee and his army and bring an end to the war. Sherman destroyed and consumed everything in his path. He burned down much of Atlanta, forcing the people to evacuate during the march to the sea. Sherman took most of his army to Savannah while destroying everything that could possibly help the South. He led his army all the way up to South Carolina and left behind 400 miles of ruins. The Battle of Appomattox was the last battle of the Civil War. General Lee asked for the terms to surrender and met with Grant to surrender with his army. Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation to free all slaves in the rebelling states, but the slaves of the border states loyal to the Union remained enslaved. This caused the slaves to rebel and join the Union Army. It increased the sympathy from Europe, so Europe wouldn't be able to help the South. President Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address during the Civil War after the Battle of Gettysburg. The key ideas of the speech were liberty, equality, and democratic ideas. The purpose of the war was to protect those ideas and reaffirm the Declaration of Independence. The speech was given to tell the nation the Civil War would bring true equality to all citizens and that it would create a unified nation where all men were created equal.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
To finance the war, both sides used war bonds, and they had to be paid back in gold or silver. Both sides also recognized tax limitations, so they started to print paper money. The Union officials made the greenbacks legal tender, which allowed the government to issue paper money, and since they were fiat money, they caused inflation. But it was the first time that the federal government had to work to create a uniform currency. To get more soldiers into the Army, the Enrollment Act was passed in March 1863, which stated that every enabled white male between the ages of 20 to 25 faced a possible draft, but to avoid some issues they allowed substitutions, where one could pay another man to serve instead. They also offered fees of $300 to the government to avoid being drafted. But of course, nothing can be avoided. Draft riots started to occur in several states, but New York was the most violent. The citizens and the Irish workers hated the idea of being drafted to fight for the slaves and then have them take their jobs. President Lincoln sent federal troops to stop the riots. Many civil rights during the Civil War were affected, just like the habeas corpus, which was the idea that no one could be taken into prison without first being charged with a specific crime or consent of the court. Lincoln suspended the privilege of the writs, and anti-unionists could now be arrested. For example, the ex parte Merryman in 1861, Chief Justice Taney made a ruling that Lincoln had passed his authority in suspending the writs in Maryland. Lincoln ignored Taney's ruling and argued that the Constitution allowed the suspension because it was due to a rebellion. Maryland and Delaware rejected the secession. Jefferson Davis also suspended the writs and imposed martial law. Copperheads were Northerners who sympathized with the South during the Civil War. They undermined the war effort and posed a threat to Lincoln's re-election. Clement was a Copperhead who ran to become governor of Ohio while still in exile in Canada. Life on the home front was similar on both sides. Women and children had to take on new roles during the war. In cities and towns, women signed on to do jobs which originally were held by men, such as working as clerks. On small farms, north and south, women and children raised the crops and tended the animals and livestock. On large plantations in the South, women had to extend their duties beyond the household and into the fields, relaying orders to overseers and slaves. Within the Confederacy, schools and churches closed down due to the disruption of the war and the enlistment of so many men. Many families in the Upper South and in coastal areas of the Confederacy were living in war zones and relocated early in the war.
Heavens, no man, no weapon formed against, yes, glory is destined. Everyday women and men become legends. Sins that go against our skin become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion to us. Justice is juxtaposition in us. Justice for all just ain't specific enough. One son died, his spirit is revisiting us. True and living in us. Resistance is us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walk through Ferguson with our hands up. When it go down, we woman and man up. They say stay down, and we stand up. Shots, we on the ground.